What do we mean by the human spirit? How is it relevant to the efforts being made around the world to meet the challenges that define this moment in history? Notions of identity grounded in outworn conceptualizations of race, gender, class, and nationality continue to pose serious threats to our collective future. At the same time, everything that had once been associated with the human spirit is often understood today only in terms of neurobiology and cognitive science. In the George Ronald publication, Our Common Humanity: Reflections on the Reclamation of the Human Spirit, its author, Dr. Michael Penn, argues that if the 21st century is to be any different from the last, the protection and development of the human spirit will have to emerge as an appropriate focus for judging the moral legitimacy of human acts, social policy, or cultural or religious practices. I'm Rob Weinberg, and in this episode I'm joined by Dr. Michael Penn to discuss his exploration of the unique perspectives contained in the Baha'i writings, alongside the rich diversity of other practices and traditions that have contributed to our understanding of the nature and needs of the human spirit over the ages. Welcome to Great Reads, the George Ronald Podcast. Dr. Michael Penn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
The concept of the human spirit forms the cornerstone of your work, and the title of your book references reclamation of the human spirit, suggesting something's been lost or obscured. What historical or contemporary forces do you see as having diminished our understanding or nurturing of the human spirit?
You may know that in the early 1800s, there were only 3 firmly established subspecialties of medicine. There was surgery, which developed tremendously because of the need to treat physical wounds. There was internal medicine, which can be traced back to the Greeks and Hippocrates, the Egyptians. A number of cultures developed internal medicine. And then there was neurology. But there was no such discipline that we call psychiatry. Psychiatry emerges out of neurology because of a problem that neurologists could not solve, and that was the problem of hysteria. Hysteria had existed for a long time and had been understood as a serious problem that women were suffering, but we did not know the cause of hysteria. And so at a hospital in Paris called Les Salpêtrières, there were women who were suffering from hysteria, and there was a neurologist by the name of Jean-Martin Charcot who wanted to discover the physical cause of hysteria. And so he would conduct these grand round examinations of women who were suffering from hysteria every Tuesday afternoon. Physicians would come from around the world to behold these things because he was quite a fascinating lecturer. One day, Sigmund Freud was in the audience, and also Pierre Janet. Sigmund Freud was disturbed by the examination because he thought that every time Charcot touched the patient, the symptoms of hysteria became worse. And so he decided that he wasn't going to touch his patients who were suffering from hysteria. He was going to ask them about their lives. And he discovered that as he asked them about their lives, they all tended to tell a very similar story. When I was 9, when I was 10, when I was 11, my brother, my father, my uncle did something to me sexual. So Freud was fascinated by this, but there was no way to understand how these women would develop a neurological problem based upon a social experience. So he needed a different concept of the person that involved the powers of the mind. The neurologists were largely ignoring the mind. They were thinking really of the brain and the nervous system. But he said there must be another aspect of our identity, which he's calling the mind. Now, of course, Descartes had written a great deal about the mind, and other philosophers had as well. But Freud wanted a different conceptualization of the mind. He said the mind must not be thought of as a spiritual or abstract thing. He says the mind is produced by the body and the brain in the same way that it produces saliva, heat, urine, and bile. So the mind is not a special thing. It doesn't occupy a special ontological category. It's just another physical object that emerges when the body and brain are constituted in a particular way. And so essentially what he did was he created a theory of the mind that separated the mind from anything like a soul or a spirit or anything like that. But I think that there were enormous consequences of this reconceptualization. On the one hand, it helped to develop a kind of a science of the mind, right? Because the mind could then become the object of empirical study. of clinical research, of treatment. On the other hand, it created a sea of problems that we're also now dealing with in a very substantial way. You may know that Abdu'l-Baha was in discourse with these early psychiatrists, and that, in fact, he wrote a tablet to a psychiatrist by the name of Auguste Forel. And in this tablet, Auguste Forel and Abdu'l-Baha are in a discourse about the nature of the human person, about the nature of the mind. And Abdu'l-Baha is trying to persuade him that it is illogical to think that the mind is produced by the body in the same way that the body produces things like heat or saliva, so on and so forth. I became fascinated by this discussion between Auguste Forel and Abdu'l-Baha. And because I was being trained as an experimental psychopathologist and also as a clinical psychologist, the movement between this philosophical discourse and the empirical work that we were doing in labs captivated my imagination, captivated my attention. So I wanted to learn more about the history of this discourse. I wanted to make some kind of contribution that was Baha'i inspired to this evolving discussion. But it's a very complex discussion. And I have to admit from the outset that I am basically a child wandering in this vast field of just profound work.
You discuss how modern discourse often reduces what we might call spiritual qualities to purely neurobiological functions. What do you think is lost when we understand human experience exclusively through that materialistic lens?
What is lost is our identity. What is lost is our consciousness of who and what we are. There's a wonderful story told by a developmental psychologist about a man who is cut off from the conveniences of modern society, and so he doesn't have electricity. One day, he receives electricity and has a radio, and he hears on the radio that he has been the fortunate winner of a refrigerator. The man orders that the refrigerator, when it's delivered, be placed on his porch, and he brings out his hats, his gloves, his overalls, his shoes, and he fills the refrigerator with these things. He doesn't know what a refrigerator is, so he's not able to exploit the full potential of the refrigerator. So if we don't know what we are as human beings, it's very difficult for us to exploit the full potential of human consciousness, the full potential of the human mind, of the human spirit, of the human soul. And so we become trapped in conceptualizations of ourselves that prevent us from the kind of development that we're capable of, and also the kind of society building, the kind of civilization making that is within our reach.
So we're talking about the human spirit then being central in terms of the health and the well-being of the individual, but also in terms of the reconstruction of a society or a world order which is clearly defective. So in reclaiming the human spirit, how do we then see that playing out, do you think, in, for example, institutions or the realm of politics or the realm of human rights or public affairs?
That's a really big question, but maybe I'll address a couple of very small elements of it. After the Second World War, there were these trials in Nuremberg, in Tokyo, and in Jerusalem. These were the trials of the Nazis. And one of the Nazis who was on trial, his name was Adolf Eichmann. And Adolf Eichmann made a very interesting claim. Adolf Eichmann said, "I have nothing against the Jews. I was simply carrying out my responsibilities as an officer under the guidance of the head of state, Adolf Hitler." But the jurist at that time did not accept that argument, and in fact created a unique kind of crime that had not existed before. They said that he had committed crimes against humanity. He was charged with 4 things. One of those was crimes against humanity. But the jurists didn't really know exactly what they meant by humanity, because they didn't mean the people that are living at a particular time. They meant a set of capacities. They meant a set of potentialities that Nazism sought to destroy. They didn't want a certain manifestation of humanity to exist on the planet. And so I became interested in trying to say something about this phenomenon is that they were trying to protect when they created this new crime called crimes against humanity. What is humanity? How does it manifest itself? How does it grow? What are the signs of humanity? How does humanity differ from other kinds of things that exist in the natural world? It seems to me that unless we're able to get a very clear perception of that, we won't be able to protect even our own interests, let alone the interest of the natural world. And so if we want to protect humanity, we have to know what are the capacities of humanity. When I'm protecting humanity, what precisely am I seeking to secure? What am I seeking to advance when I advance the interests, the capacities, the powers of humanity? And I think that in order to answer that question, you have to know a little bit about what I described in this book. You need to know a little bit about the human spirit. And so I try to give a rational, Baha'i-inspired account of what might be meant by the human spirit.
And what is meant by the human spirit, in your opinion?
In the simplest terms, I think of the human spirit as embodying three basic powers. There are different kinds of powers in the world. There are powers of nature, and there are powers of consciousness. And I think of the human spirit as the embodiment of certain powers of consciousness that are unique. For example, the capacity or the power to know. The power to know takes as its object truth, truth about the self and truth about the world. There are different kinds of truths. For example, if I say to you, I'm hungry, and I really mean that, I've expressed a subjective truth. But there are truths that are, of course, outside of ourselves, the knowledge of which renders us more effective in the world. The more we know, the more effective we can be in creating the kinds of conditions that are necessary in order to facilitate the development of the human spirit, the protection of the human spirit. And the first of these capacities is the capacity to know. Human beings have a hunger for knowledge. They have a desire to know all kinds of things. And so we have to create the conditions wherein this capacity to know can flourish. What are those conditions? The second capacity is the capacity to love. I think about the capacity to love as a capacity that takes as its object beauty, the beauty of an idea, the beauty of nature, the beauty of a way of life. When we cultivate this intrinsic interest that we have in beauty, we see that the arts, the architecture, the institutionalization of our attraction to beauty brings forth beautiful gardens, and we protect the natural world because we love it, because we think that it is deserving of our care, deserving of our attention. And this capacity to love is in desperate need of deeper understanding, of cultivation, right? Because there are many forces that can destroy this capacity to love. And in my own work, I study, for example, how various forms of mistreatment and abuse can paralyze or destroy the intrinsic capacity to love. And then finally, the human spirit is animated by the capacity to will, the capacity to choose, to decide, to make a value choice. When I make a value choice, what I do is I sacrifice something that is perceived to be of lesser value for something that is of greater value. And this ability to make value choices is, of course, the very foundation of society building, is the very foundation of community life. If I'm unable to think well about value choices, I get myself entwined in all kinds of problems that I needn't necessarily be harassed by, troubled by, destroyed by. And so I think that I'm interested in the human spirit because I'm interested in contributing to the prosperity of humankind. And so if we're going to contribute to the prosperity of humankind, we need to know what humankind consists in. What is the nature of humankind?
I was just thinking, so for example, let's say the human rights discourse, which often focuses, as you say, on physical protections and legal rights, material needs. So what might a focus on the human spirit address that is currently lacking in that particular discourse?
It might address, for example, the extraordinary capacity of human beings to change, to transform even when the longings, the capacities of the human spirit are summoned to the kinds of problems that we face in the world. Let me give you a very practical example that the United Nations addressed some years ago. So you may know that one of the major problems in the world is the problem of violence against women and girls. And this problem is very serious in many villages. And also it's a serious problem in cities around the world. So it's not confined to any particular socioeconomic class, but imagine a village in which this is a very serious problem. So the United Nations, in consultation with the Baha'i international community, visited one of these communities and asked the women to describe the three most serious problems that they were facing as women. The women said, first, we don't have enough financial resources to care for our children and for ourselves. Second, our husbands and our partners commonly beat us. And this is both humiliating and also it causes our children to suffer. And thirdly, we don't really know our partners very well. We don't spend very much time with them. They asked the men in a separate meeting, what do you think are the three most serious problems that you face? And the men said, we have no work, we're bored. And so we leave our village when the sun rises and we go out to drink. And in the afternoon, we come back. And when we come back, we're humiliated, we're ashamed. And because we're drunk and humiliated and ashamed, sometimes we fight with our spouses. They also said, we feel that we don't have enough resources to care for our children, to care for our families. So the UN asked the question, can anything be done about this? And the women, to the surprise of the United Nations, came back with a very interesting thought. They said, because our men don't understand the nature of this problem, we should perform it for them. We should perform it in a play. And the UN said, that's a great idea. Why don't you perform what it's like to be a woman in this village in a play? So they performed this play, and the play was performed on a Saturday in the middle of the village. The children were present and the men were present, and it was very powerful because it was, on the one hand, hysterically funny, and on the other hand, very moving. And the men could see themselves through the eyes of the women in the village. You might say that their hearts were moved in a very profound way, in ways that normally speeches or data would not move them. The men became interested in this problem of them beating up the women. But the men said, the women also don't understand our situation. They don't understand what we go through. So they said, can we perform what it's like to be a man in this village? So they performed this leaving the village, this day of feeling bored and humiliated and drinking and coming back and feeling on edge, and the children not liking them. So the children are alienated from them. So they're performing these things. And what we have is we have an inner discourse that finds an outer expression through the arts, through this medium that the human spirit is capable of. And it deepens understanding in ways that empower the men and the women. The men decide, for example, that the following day, they're not going to leave the village. They're just going to spend a day in the village. And to make a long story short, what they discover is it's much more interesting to be in the village than to be out on the stump. There are ways that they could help. They could make a difference. Over the course of a year, because they were helping, the village started to acquire resources that did not have before. The harvest, for example, was bigger. Anyway, so these are very simple ways of drawing upon the powers of the human spirit to address very serious problems in very simple ways.
In your book, you also suggest that some of the kind of socially constructed conceptualizations of race and gender and class, nationality in themselves pose serious threats also to our collective future. And then at the same time, some communities may fear that emphasizing our common humanity could erase some important distinctions or minimize historical oppressions. So this framework that you're putting forward or trying to evolve, how does it address these concerns while still promoting unity? And I guess the principle of unity and diversity needs to inform your approach as well in somehow overcoming these constructs of identity which are divisive.
I don't think that constructs of identity are themselves divisive. I think that part of knowing who we are is knowing, for example, our cultural heritage, is knowing our language, is knowing the approach to life that our peoples have taken over centuries, right? So knowing about our families, knowing about our culture, knowing about our language, knowing about the way that we in particular express the arts, all of these things are beautiful. They're not problematic at all. They only become problematic when we define otherness in ways that fail to appreciate or fail to value the unique contribution that, for example, the African Americans can make to advancing the interest of humanity because of their unique history, the unique contributions of the Native Americans, because of their intimate connections with nature, their love of nature, their humility before nature. So we have a lot to learn from one another. And so we have a lot to learn from one another precisely because we come from very diverse backgrounds. So what we need to reconceptualize diversity in such a way that we're able to harvest what is useful and lay aside what is problematic and not useful. We're trying to study these things in a kind of an empirical way in my laboratory. One of the concepts that we think is very important to appreciating the human spirit is this concept of intrinsic value. And we were interested in whether or not children are capable of perceiving intrinsic value. And so we conducted a very interesting experiment a few years ago where we invited these children into our lab and we presented them with a moral dilemma. These are 5 and 6-year-old children. We brought into the laboratory a baby rabbit and a tulip. And we said to the children, we only have enough water for one of these creatures to survive until tomorrow. If we share the water between the rabbit and the tulip, both the rabbit and the tulip will die. Who should we give the water to and why? 5 and 6-year-old children were able to say to us, I think we should give the water to the rabbit, but we're not sure about why. They couldn't explain why, but they felt very sure that this was the case. Then we brought into the room a baby rabbit and a baby child. And we said, children, we only have enough water for one of these creatures to survive until tomorrow. If we share the water, they will both die. Who should we give the water to? The children concluded without any difficulty that we should give the water to the child, but they were distressed by the thought that the rabbit would die. So they perceived that the rabbit has value, that the rabbit should not die for no good reason, but they could clearly see that the child should have the water. We brought into the room a black baby and a white baby, and we said, we only have enough water for one of these children to survive until tomorrow. Who should we give the water to and why? This caused the children to squirm and to really, they were quite upset with that problem. Children have wonderful imagination. So if you bring them into a lab and you tell them a story of this sort, they believe you. They were really struggling with this. We suppose that they were struggling with this because they could perceive that the intrinsic value of the black baby and the white baby was the same. There was no real difference between the black baby and the white baby. This capacity to perceive the oneness of humanity. We have this capacity to perceive that we are basically the same. But this capacity can be grossly distorted. And when it's grossly distorted, we do horrible things to one another simply because we're not understanding what we are. And when we do terrible things to others, we do also terrible things to ourselves. So we stunt and we impact our own development because we're trying to hamper or destroy the development of another person or another culture or another community. If we desire to achieve our prosperity, our well-being, our development, we have to be interested in the well-being and development of others. I'm interested in part in laying a kind of a rational basis for an understanding of the relationship between our views of our own identity and our behavior on a day-to-day basis.
We don't have time to go into all the aspects of your book. And of course, we want to encourage people to read your book and to reflect on all the things that you've been exploring there. But just finally, your work spans decades. You've been able to observe societal changes over long periods of time. Do you see progress in how societies approach the development of the human spirit, or are we now facing new challenges that previous generations didn't?
That's a very interesting question. I am hopeful and optimistic for 2 reasons. The first reason is that the challenges that we're facing, the difficulties that we're facing, are precisely the kinds of difficulties that will illuminate the ways in which we need to change. In other words, for example, I live in the United States, and my wife was telling me this morning, when you live in the United States, it's easy if you live in the middle class where everything is provided for you. You have your nice car, you have your refrigerator, you have your luxuries. It's very easy for you to become unaware of how serious the problems of the world are. What a dire situation we are finding ourselves in. In the last few years, even the most asleep of us are compelled to recognize that the world is in very serious condition. Los Angeles nearly burned to the ground. We are confronted now with greater and greater difficulty to be blind to the challenges that are before us. And so first we must see these challenges before we can address them. And so I'm optimistic and hopeful in part because we are becoming every day more and more aware that we need to think ourselves free. We need to liberate ourselves of old patterns of behavior, of old patterns of thought. We need to address in serious ways the challenges that beset, in fact, the entire planet. So that for me is a cause of optimism and hopefulness. First, you must understand, and then you can take action. So that's the first reason why I'm hopeful. The second reason is, in my own lifetime, I've observed extraordinary changes, for example, along the issue of race and racism. And those changes have been quite dramatic. And so I see us making tremendous strides, tremendous advances. My kids, my children, and their peers have attitudes towards race and class and gender that are centuries ahead of the attitudes that I grew up in. When I was in the Navy, traveling throughout the world as a submariner, one encountered at every turn some kind of racial crisis. There was no place that you could be where you weren't experiencing these kinds of crises. That situation has changed quite radically. And so we're demonstrating our capacity for change. And I think that we need to encourage one another to continue in those directions. The resurgence, for example, of nationalism, the resurgence of various forms of religious fanaticism, the resurgence of systems of terrorism that are explained by invoking high-minded theories or high-minded ideas. These things we are starting to see very plainly as obviously false, as obviously unhelpful. I think that we have to continue to move in those directions. You're a member of the press. And I think, for example, the press, the members of the press, have to play a very special role in edifying the communities around the world about the condition of the world. And the members of the press mustn't be frightened back into a hole. I think that there are many efforts underway to shield, to veil certain truths that are uncomfortable for us to face. And so I think that the press is going to play a really important role in not only highlighting the challenges that are before us, but also revealing the progress that is being made in many quarters, while we at the same time are struggling with these tremendous difficulties.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us today, and thank you very much for your book. It's been really fascinating, and hope that people will be inspired to read further. Our Common Humanity, Reflections on the Reclamation of the Human Spirit, is available now from grbooks.com and from your National Baha'i Publishing Trust or distribution service. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Great Reads, the George Ronald Podcast.